My son won the lottery, kicked me out of the house, and said, "You're worthless. Go live in a nursing home." I wandered aimlessly to clear my mind. When I sat down on a bench, a homeless man walked up to me, smiled, and said, "You look just like my late wife, but I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Glenda, and at 69 years old, I never imagined my own son would throw me out like garbage on the coldest day of February. But that's exactly what Richard did, standing in the doorway of what used to be my home, his eyes cold as winter steel. "Pack your things, Mother. You're leaving today." I stood there in my worn slippers, still holding the cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hands. "What are you talking about, Richard? This is my house, too." He let out a harsh laugh that made my skin crawl. "Was your house. Things change when you win $23 million in the lottery." He held up the winning ticket like it was some kind of weapon. "I don't need dead weight anymore." Dead weight. That's what my only child called me. The same boy I'd raised alone after his father died 15 years ago, or so I thought. The same boy I'd sacrificed everything for, working double shifts at the diner just to put food on our table and clothes on his back. "Richard, please, let's talk about this reasonably. I'm your mother." "You're a burden," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You've been nothing but a burden my entire life. Do you know how embarrassing it's been? Having friends over and seeing you shuffling around in those old clothes? Complaining about your arthritis?" Each word hit me like a physical blow. I set my coffee cup down on the kitchen counter with shaking hands, trying to process what was happening. "I raised you. I worked myself to the bone for you when your father passed away. And what good did that do me?" Richard stepped closer, his face twisted with contempt. "Look at this dump. Look at you. You're pathetic. All those years of scraping pennies together, and for what? So we could live in this embarrassment of a house?" I looked around the small kitchen where I'd made countless meals, where I'd helped him with homework at the scarred wooden table, where I'd celebrated his 25th birthday just last month. It wasn't much, but it was home. "This house has memories, Richard. This is where we built our life together after your father died." "My father?" He practically spat the words. "You know what? I'm glad he's dead. At least he doesn't have to see what a failure his wife became." The cruelty in his voice made my knees weak. I grabbed onto the back of a chair to steady myself. "How can you say that? He loved us both so much." "Love doesn't pay bills, Mother. Love doesn't buy respect. And love certainly doesn't win the lottery." He waved the ticket again. "This does. This changes everything. And the first thing that's changing is you. You're leaving." I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Not yet. Where am I supposed to go?" "There's a state-run nursing home about 20 minutes from here, Sunset Manor. I already called them. They have a bed available." The casualness in his voice, like he was discussing the weather, made my stomach turn. "Richard, I'm not sick. I don't need a nursing home." "You don't have value, Mother. That's what you need to understand." He pulled out his cell phone and started scrolling through it, already dismissing me. "You're old, you're poor, and you have nothing to offer anyone. At least at Sunset Manor, the state will pay for you." I stared at this stranger who wore my son's face. Where was the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms? Where was the teenager who'd promised to take care of me when I got old? This cold, calculating man couldn't be the same person I'd loved unconditionally for 28 years. "I have some money saved," I whispered. "Not much, but enough to get a small apartment somewhere." Richard looked up from his phone, his eyes lighting up with cruel amusement. "Oh, you mean that coffee can in your bedroom closet? The one with about $800 in it?" My heart stopped. That money represented years of putting aside $5 or $10 whenever I could, skipping meals to save for emergencies. It was my only security in the world. "You went through my things? It's my house now, Mother. Everything in it belongs to me, including your pathetic little nest egg." He held up a wad of crumpled bills. "Consider it back rent for all the years you've been a financial drain on me." The violation felt worse than the theft. He'd gone through my private belongings, my most personal space, and taken the only security I had left in the world. "You can't do this, Richard. I'm your mother. You were my mother, he corrected. Now you're just an old woman who needs to learn her place. He checked his watch like this was just another appointment in his day. The taxi will be here in 10 minutes. You can take one suitcase. Everything else stays here. I looked around the kitchen one more time, seeing 15 years of memories in every corner. The refrigerator covered with his school achievements, the windowsill where I'd grown herbs for cooking, the table where we'd shared thousands of meals together. All of it would stay behind while I was cast out into the world with nothing. What happened to you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. When did you become so heartless? Richard shrugged, already walking toward the door. Money happened, Mother. Money shows you what really matters in life, and you've never mattered. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom on unsteady legs, each step feeling like a mountain. My small suitcase sat on the bed where Richard had apparently thrown it, already half-packed with my oldest clothes. He hadn't even bothered to include my photo albums or the few pieces of jewelry my husband had given me before he died. As I added my medications and a few personal items, I could hear Richard downstairs on the phone, probably calling friends to brag about his lottery win. His laughter echoed through the house, sharp and foreign. The taxi honked outside exactly 10 minutes later. I dragged my suitcase down the stairs, my arthritic hands struggling with the weight. Richard was nowhere to be seen when I reached the front door. Standing on the porch of the home where I'd spent 15 years, I turned back one last time. Through the kitchen window, I could see Richard counting money, my money, at the same table where I'd once helped him learn to read. The taxi driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, got out to help me with my suitcase. You okay, ma'am? You look upset. I wanted to tell him that my son had just destroyed my world. I wanted to explain that I had nowhere to go and no one who cared whether I lived or died. Instead, I just nodded and climbed into the back seat. Where to? He asked gently. I gave him the address for Sunset Manor, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. But as we pulled away from the house, I made a decision that surprised even me. Actually, I said, my voice stronger than I felt, just take me to the downtown area. I need some time to think. As we drove through the familiar streets of the town where I'd lived my entire adult life, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Richard had been planning this. The phone call to the nursing home, going through my personal belongings, even the timing, it was all calculated. My own son had been waiting for the right moment to throw me away like trash. But what hurt most wasn't the cruelty or even the homelessness. It was the realization that the person I'd loved most in the world had never really loved me back. And now, at 69 years old, I was completely and utterly alone. I wandered the streets for what felt like hours, my suitcase wheels catching on every crack in the sidewalk. The February wind cut through my thin coat like it was made of paper, and my fingers had long since gone numb from the cold. Downtown looked different somehow, smaller and more run-down than I remembered, with several storefronts boarded up and for rent signs hanging like surrender flags. My feet were screaming by the time I spotted the small park nestled between two aging office buildings. Riverside Park, where I used to bring Richard to feed the ducks when he was small. The memory felt like looking at someone else's life now. The bench closest to the pathway was empty, probably because it offered no protection from the wind, but I didn't care. I needed to sit down before I collapsed. My suitcase toppled over as I sank onto the cold metal slats, and I didn't have the energy to right it. That's when the reality of my situation hit me like a truck. I was homeless. At 69 years old, I was sitting on a park bench with everything I owned in a single suitcase, and I had no idea what to do next. The nursing home Richard had mentioned would probably take me, but the thought of spending my remaining years in a state-run facility, forgotten and abandoned, made my chest tight with panic. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and tried to think rationally. I could get a job, maybe go back to waitressing, though most places preferred younger servers. I could find a room to rent somewhere, though without references or a deposit that seemed impossible. I could try to contact distant relatives, though I'd lost touch with most of them years ago. Every option felt hopeless. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice startled me out of my dark thoughts. I looked up to see a man standing a few feet away, and my first instinct was fear. He was clearly homeless. His clothes were layered and worn, his hair long and unkempt, and he carried a weathered backpack that looked like it contained his entire life. But his eyes weren't threatening. They were confused, almost shocked. "I'm sorry," I said, gripping my purse tighter. "I don't have any money." He didn't move closer, just stood there staring at me with the strangest expression. "Ma'am, I don't want money. It's just—" He paused, shaking his head like he was trying to clear it. "You look exactly like someone I used to know." I studied his face more carefully. He was probably around my age, maybe a few years older, with gray hair that might have been dark brown once upon a time. There was something familiar about his features, but I couldn't place it. The streets had weathered him hard, making it difficult to see past the rough exterior. "I'm sorry," I said again, softer this time. "I don't think we've met." He took a hesitant step closer, his eyes never leaving my face. "Your hair. It's still that same shade of auburn. And your eyes, they're still that deep brown I remember." His voice cracked slightly. "Ma'am, this is going to sound crazy, but what's your name?" Something in his tone made me answer honestly. "Glenda. Glenda Morrison." The man's face went completely white. He stumbled backward like I'd physically struck him, his backpack sliding off his shoulder and hitting the ground with a soft thud. For a moment, I thought he might faint. "That's impossible," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "She's dead. I buried her 15 years ago." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the February cold. "I'm sorry, I think you have me confused with someone else." But he was shaking his head vigorously, tears starting to stream down his weathered cheeks. "Glenda Morrison, born June 15, 1954, married to Blaine Morrison on October 12, 1973, had a son named Richard in 1995. My world tilted sideways. Those were my details, my life. But there was only one person who should know all of them, and that person had been dead for 15 years. "Blaine?" The name came out as barely a whisper. He nodded, his whole body shaking now. "Glenda, is it really you? Please tell me this isn't some kind of cruel hallucination." I stared at this homeless stranger, trying to see my husband in his features. Blaine had been clean-shaven, well-dressed, always smelling of the cologne I bought him for Christmas. This man was rough around the edges, marked by years of hard living. But those eyes. Those were Blaine's eyes, the same warm brown that used to look at me like I was the most precious thing in the world. "You're dead," I said stupidly. "Richard told me you died in a car accident 15 years ago. We had a memorial service. I mourned you." Blaine sank onto the bench beside me, careful to keep some distance between us. "Richard told me you died of cancer. Said you fought it for months but didn't want me to know because you didn't want me to see you suffer." His voice broke completely. He showed me medical bills, death certificates, everything. The pieces started clicking together in my mind with horrible clarity. "When did he tell you this?" "February 23, 2009. Said you'd pass 3 days earlier." Blaine wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "That was right around the time the business started having financial troubles. Richard said he'd handle everything, that I should focus on grieving." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "He told me you died February 26, 2009. Said you'd had a heart attack while driving and crashed into a tree. Closed casket funeral because—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Because there wasn't a body," Blaine completed, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Just like there wasn't a body for your funeral either." We sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of Richard's deception washing over both of us. My son, our son, had deliberately torn apart our family with lies. He'd made each of us believe the other was dead, then used our grief to manipulate and control us. "The business," I said slowly. "Morrison Construction. What happened to it?" Blaine's face darkened. "Richard convinced me to sign power of attorney while I was, quote, too grief-stricken to make rational decisions. Said he'd keep the company running until I was ready to take back control. But I never got better, Glenda. Losing you destroyed me." I reached out instinctively and touched his hand. It was rough and cold, but unmistakably his. I know. Losing you nearly killed me too. He took everything, Blaine continued, his voice hollow. First, he moved all the company assets into accounts I couldn't access. Then he started selling off equipment and properties. When I finally tried to fight back, he had me declared mentally incompetent due to depression and substance abuse. Substance abuse? Blaine looked ashamed. I started drinking after you died. Richard used that against me, said I was an unfit guardian for myself, let alone a business owner. By the time I realized what was happening, Morrison Construction belonged to him completely, and I was living on the streets. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Richard hadn't just stolen our money, he'd stolen 15 years of our lives together. He'd condemned his own father to homelessness and let his mother believe she was a widow, all so he could claim an inheritance that wasn't rightfully his. How long have you been living like this? I asked, gesturing to his backpack and worn clothes. 12 years, he said quietly. Lost the house 3 years after you supposedly died. Richard said he couldn't afford to help me, that the business debts were too overwhelming. I believed him because I was too heartbroken to think straight. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and fierce. I worked at Murphy's Diner all these years, thinking I was supporting us both on my own. Richard lived with me rent-free, let me cook and clean for him, take care of him like he was still a child. And the whole time, he was living off the money he stole from you. From us, Blaine corrected gently. That company was our future, our retirement plan. We built it together. Looking at him now, I could see past the rough exterior to the man I'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. The same gentle soul, the same kind heart, just broken by years of unnecessary grief and hardship. Blaine, I said, my voice shaking. Richard kicked me out today. Won the lottery and decided he didn't need his useless mother anymore. I have nowhere to go. He turned to look at me fully for the first time, and I saw the old Blaine clearly now. My husband, my partner, my best friend. The man I'd loved and mourned and missed every single day for 15 years. We'll figure it out together, he said simply, and squeezed my hand. Sitting on that cold park bench, homeless and heartbroken, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years. Hope, because I wasn't alone anymore. Against all odds, against all logic, I had my husband back. But first, we had to figure out how to survive the night. The homeless shelter on Maple Street wasn't much to look at, but it was warm and dry, which was more than Blaine had expected in months, and more than I'd dared hope for in my current situation. The volunteer at the front desk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, had taken pity on us when Blaine explained that we were a married couple who'd just found each other after years of separation. We have one bed available in the women's section and one in the men's, she'd said apologetically. Spouses can't room together, but you can spend time in the common area until 9 p.m. So here we sat, side by side on a worn couch that had seen better decades, sharing a cup of watery coffee and trying to piece together 15 years of stolen time. The common room buzzed with quiet conversations, the soft murmur of people who'd learned to keep their voices down in shared spaces. Tell me about Richard growing up, Blaine said quietly, his hands wrapped around the warm cup like it was a lifeline. After I supposedly died, what was he like? I thought back to those early years when grief had made everything feel distant and unreal. He changed almost immediately. Before you died, before he told me you died, he was still somewhat caring, you know. He'd ask about my day, help with groceries sometimes. But after the funeral, I paused, remembering how cold Richard had become in the weeks following Blaine's supposed death. At the time, I'd attributed it to grief, thinking he was processing the loss in his own way. He became controlling, I continued, started making all the decisions about money, about the house, about everything, said I was too emotional to think clearly, that I needed to rely on him for guidance. Blaine's jaw tightened. He said the same thing to me about the business, that I was too grief-stricken to make rational decisions. It was more than that, though. He started isolating me from people. When my sister called to check on me, Richard would answer and tell her I wasn't up for visitors. When neighbors tried to bring casseroles or offer condolences, he'd send them away, saying I needed space to heal. The pattern was becoming clearer as I spoke it aloud, and it made my stomach turn. Within 6 months, I barely left the house except to work at the diner. Richard convinced me that staying busy was the only way to cope with losing you, so I picked up extra shifts, worked doubles, anything to keep from thinking about how empty our bed felt at night. Blaine reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm the way he used to when we were young. "I'm so sorry, Glenda. All those years you were working yourself to death, and I was sleeping under bridges, and meanwhile he was living like a king," I finished bitterly. "Do you want to know the worst part? He made me feel guilty for grieving too long. After about 2 years, he started making comments about how I needed to move on and stop wallowing in the past. Said you wouldn't want me to be sad forever." "What kind of comments?" I could feel my face heating up with shame and anger. He'd bring home newspaper clippings about widows who remarried, leave them on the kitchen table like hints. When I'd cry on your birthday or our anniversary, he'd roll his eyes and tell me I was being dramatic. Once, when I was looking through our old photo albums, he actually said that holding on to memories was unhealthy and that I should consider putting your pictures away. Blaine was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He was trying to erase me, not just from the business or the legal documents, but from your heart too. "Yes," I whispered. "And when I refused to pack away your things or stop talking about you, he started getting nastier. Made comments about how I was embarrassing myself, clinging to a dead man. Said I was too old to attract anyone else anyway, so I might as well accept being alone." The memory of Richard's cruel words still stung, even now. I'd internalized so much of his criticism over the years, believing that my grief was excessive, that my love for Blaine was somehow pathetic. "What about you?" I asked, needing to shift focus away from my own pain. "What happened after he told you I was gone?" Blaine stared down at his coffee cup, his shoulders sagging with the weight of memory. I believed him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was our son. He showed me what looked like medical bills from your cancer treatment, receipts for prescriptions I'd never heard of, even a death certificate that looked official. He forged all of that? Must have. Or paid someone to do it. The paperwork was convincing enough that I never questioned it. Blaine's voice was hollow. "He said you'd specifically requested that I not be told about the diagnosis because you didn't want me to see you suffer, that you'd spent your last months in a hospice facility, being cared for by professionals." The elaborate lie took my breath away. Richard had constructed an entire fictional narrative around my death, complete with documentation and backstory. The level of premeditation was chilling. "He played on my guilt," Blaine continued. "Said you died believing I was too busy with work to notice how sick you were getting. That your last words were wondering why I hadn't spent more time with you." Tears started flowing down my cheeks. "Blaine, no. I never said any of those things because I never had cancer. I was healthy as a horse that entire year. I know that now, but at the time..." He shook his head. "It destroyed me, Glenda. The guilt, the grief, the regret. I couldn't work, couldn't think straight. Richard stepped in and handled everything. The funeral arrangements, the business decisions, the legal paperwork. I was grateful to have him take care of things. And that's when he started stealing from you, gradually at first. He'd bring me documents to sign, explaining them as necessary business transactions or estate planning. I signed whatever he put in front of me because I trusted him, and because I couldn't concentrate on anything except missing you." Blaine set down his coffee cup and rubbed his temples like he was fighting a headache. "The drinking started about 3 months after your supposed death. Just a glass of whiskey before bed to help me sleep, then a couple drinks with dinner, then... Well, you can imagine how that progressed." I could imagine, all too well. Blaine had always been a social drinker, someone who enjoyed a beer while watching football or a glass of wine with dinner, but never to excess. Grief had obviously changed that. "Richard used the drinking against me," he continued. Said I was becoming an embarrassment to the company, that clients were noticing my behavior and taking their business elsewhere. He convinced me to let him handle more and more of the day-to-day operations while I focused on getting healthy. But you never got the help you needed. How could I? Every time I tried to get sober, tried to pull myself together, Richard would remind me of something else I'd supposedly done wrong while drinking. He'd show me contracts I'd allegedly signed while intoxicated, or tell me about phone calls I'd made to clients that I didn't remember. Looking back, I think most of those incidents were fabricated, but at the time, I believed him. The systematic destruction of Blaine's self-confidence was becoming clear. Richard had used grief, guilt, and alcohol to make his father doubt his own memory and judgment, then use that doubt to justify taking control of everything. How long did it take for you to lose the business completely? About 18 months. By then I was drinking heavily every day. Richard had convinced several key employees to quit and work for a competitor he'd secretly started, and I was too broken to fight back when he presented me with papers that essentially signed everything over to him. Blaine looked at me with eyes full of pain and shame. The worst part is, I was almost relieved when it was over. The responsibility felt too heavy. The memories of building that company with you were too painful. Richard made it seem like he was doing me a favor, taking the burden off my shoulders so I could focus on recovery. But recovery never came. How could it? Every dollar I might have used for treatment, Richard claimed was needed for business debts or legal fees. When I lost the house 2 years later, he said the market had crashed and there was nothing he could do. By the time I realized I'd been systematically robbed, I had no resources left to fight back and no credibility with anyone who might have helped me. The scope of Richard's betrayal was staggering. He hadn't just stolen money or property, he'd stolen our entire future, our golden years together, our chance to grow old side by side. He'd condemned his own father to more than a decade of homelessness and addiction while keeping his mother isolated and heartbroken. "There's something else," Blaine said quietly. "Something I found out just last year that might be important." I looked at him expectantly. Morrison Construction never went under. Richard merged it with his new company and changed the name, but the core business is still operating, still using our client list, our reputation, our contacts. He's been running what was essentially our company this entire time, just under a different name. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Richard hadn't just inherited money through lies and manipulation. He'd built his entire adult life on the foundation of our stolen business. The lottery win was just the cherry on top of years of systematic theft. "What's the company called now?" I asked. "Morrison Holdings," Blaine said with bitter irony. He kept the Morrison name, but dropped the construction part when he expanded into real estate development and property management. From what I've been able to observe from the outside, it's worth several $1,000,000. Several $1,000,000 that should have been our retirement security, our legacy, our future. Instead, Richard had used it to fund his lifestyle while his parents struggled to survive. As we sat there in that homeless shelter, processing the magnitude of what our son had done to us, I felt something shift inside me. The grief and shock were still there, but underneath them was a growing ember of determination. We'd found each other again against impossible odds. We'd survived 15 years of unnecessary suffering. And now, for the first time, we knew the truth about what had been stolen from us. Richard thought he'd won. He thought he'd successfully erased his parents from his life while keeping all the benefits of our decades of hard work. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the power of love to survive even the cruelest deceptions. And now that we were together again, we were going to take back what was ours. The next morning came too early and too cold. The women's section of the shelter woke at 5:30 a.m. sharp, and by 6 o'clock we were expected to be out on the street with our belongings, not to return until evening check-in. It was a rule designed to encourage people to look for work or housing, but for someone like me, who'd spent the night staring at the ceiling and processing the impossible reality of my husband being alive, it felt like cruel and unusual punishment. I found Blaine waiting for me in the lobby, looking as exhausted as I felt. His hair was still damp from the communal shower, and he'd managed to shave with a disposable razor someone had given him, revealing more of the face I remembered. Without the full beard, he looked more like my Blaine, just weathered by years of hardship I should have shared. "How did you sleep?" he asked, though the dark circles under his eyes suggested his night had been as restless as mine. "I didn't," I admitted. "I kept expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream, that you were still dead and I was still alone." He reached for my hand, and I let him take it, marveling at how natural the gesture still felt after all these years apart. "I know. I kept reaching for you in the middle of the night, forgetting that we can't share a bed here." The casual intimacy of his words brought tears to my eyes. How many nights had we slept apart over the past 15 years, each believing the other was gone forever? How many mornings had we woken up alone, mourning a loss that was built entirely on lies? "We need to talk," I said, "really talk, about everything we missed, everything we lost. I need to understand what these years did to you, and you need to know what they did to me." Blaine nodded. "There's a 24-hour diner about 6 blocks from here. It's cheap, and they don't mind if you sit for a while as long as you keep ordering coffee. I've spent a lot of mornings there when the shelter kicks everyone out." The walk to Mel's diner gave us time to adjust to being together in daylight, in public, as a couple again. I caught glimpses of people staring at us, an elderly woman with a suitcase walking alongside a clearly homeless man, and I realized how we must look to the outside world. Two people who didn't belong together, from different social classes, different circumstances, but they were wrong. We belonged together more than any couple I'd ever known. Mel's Diner was exactly what you'd expect from its name. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting that flickered occasionally, and coffee that had probably been sitting in the pot since midnight. But it was warm, and the waitress who seated us had kind eyes that didn't judge our appearance. "2 coffees and we'll look at the menu," Blaine told her, and I appreciated that he was taking charge of small decisions. After yesterday's upheaval, I didn't trust myself to make choices about anything, even breakfast. When we were alone, sitting across from each other in the faded red booth, the magnitude of what we had to discuss felt overwhelming. Where do you start when you have 15 years of life to catch up on? How do you bridge a gap that was supposed to be permanent? "Tell me about the worst days," I said finally. "I need to understand what you went through out there." Blaine wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and stared into the dark liquid for a long moment. "The first winter was the worst. 2010. I'd been on the streets for about 8 months by then, and I thought I knew what I was doing. Thought I'd figured out the system." He paused to take a sip of coffee, and I could see him gathering courage to continue. But January that year was brutal. Temperatures dropped below 0 for 2 weeks straight, and the shelters were full every night. I spent 3 nights sleeping in a 24-hour laundromat, curled up between the washing machines because it was the only warm place I could find that wouldn't kick me out. The image of my husband, the man who'd once owned his own construction company and employed 15 people, huddled between washing machines for warmth, made my chest tight with pain. "I got frostbite on my toes," he continued. "Lost 2 of them to infection because I couldn't afford medical care and was too proud to go to the emergency room. I kept thinking you would have insisted I go to the doctor, would have bullied me into taking care of myself. But you weren't there, and I didn't care enough about my own survival to fight for it." "Blaine, no. Let me finish. You need to hear this." His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking slightly around the mug. "That winter, I understood, really understood, that I was going to die on the streets. And I was okay with that. More than okay. I was looking forward to it, because dying meant I might see you again." The raw honesty in his words broke something loose in my chest, and tears started flowing before I could stop them. I felt the same way. Not about dying on the streets, but about wanting to die. There were nights I'd take all my sleeping pills out of the bottle and count them, wondering if I had enough. "What stopped you?" "Richard." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He needed me. Or at least I thought he needed me. I couldn't abandon him the way I felt like you had abandoned me by dying. It was the only thing that kept me going some days. The idea that I was all he had left. Blaine shook his head bitterly. Meanwhile, he was probably counting the days until you'd give up and die too, so he could inherit whatever was left. The waitress came by to refill our coffee and take our order. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and hash browns for me. The same breakfast I'd ordered at diners for 40 years, a small comfort in the chaos of everything else changing. Blaine ordered the same thing, and I wondered if he remembered it was what we used to share on Sunday mornings when we were young and couldn't afford 2 full meals. "What kept you alive?" I asked when the waitress had gone. "During the worst of it? Spite, mostly," he said with a humorless laugh. "Anger at Richard. Anger at myself for being stupid enough to trust him. Anger at you for dying and leaving me alone to figure everything out. You were angry at me?" "Furious. I know it wasn't logical, but grief doesn't follow logic. I was angry that you'd hidden your illness from me. Angry that you'd made the decision to suffer alone instead of letting me help you through it. I was angry that your last words were questioning my love instead of remembering all the ways I'd tried to show it." The grief on his face was still fresh, even knowing now that Richard had fabricated every detail of my supposed illness and death. "I used to have conversations with you in my head," he continued. "Long, angry arguments where I'd tell you exactly what I thought about your choice to shut me out at the end. I'd walk for miles, muttering under my breath like a crazy person, fighting with a dead wife who never actually said the things I was angry about. Our food arrived, interrupting the flow of painful memories. We ate in relative silence for a few minutes, both of us seemingly lost in thought. The eggs were overcooked, and the hash browns were greasy. But after months of diner food for me and shelter meals for him, it tasted like a feast. "What about you?" Blaine asked eventually. "What were your worst moments?" I set down my fork and considered the question. There had been so many dark days that they blended together into a general gray fog of sadness. "Mother's Day," I said finally. Every year, Richard would take me to brunch at some nice restaurant, and I'd sit there watching other families celebrate, listening to children thank their mothers for everything they'd done for them. And I'd think about how I'd failed as a mother, because I hadn't been enough to keep our family together. "Glenda, no. Our family fell apart because Richard destroyed it, not because you failed. I know that now, but at the time, Richard made sure I felt responsible for everything that went wrong. If the bills were tight, it was because I wasn't working enough hours. If the house needed repairs, it was because I wasn't taking proper care of things. If he seemed unhappy or distant, it was because I was too depressed to be good company." I picked at my toast, remembering the weight of guilt that had pressed down on me for years. But the absolute worst was our anniversary. October 12th every year. I'd buy flowers and put them on your grave, and then I'd go home and cook your favorite meal, even though it was just me eating it. Richard would usually find some excuse to be out of the house those nights, because he couldn't stand watching me wallow in the past, as he called it. "What was the meal?" Blaine asked softly. "Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, green bean casserole, and apple pie for dessert. The same dinner I made for our first anniversary when we were so broke, I had to borrow money from my mother for groceries." Blaine's eyes filled with tears. "I remember that dinner. You were so worried the roast would be tough, but it was perfect. Everything was perfect because we were together. I made that same meal 15 times, Blaine. 15 anniversaries of eating alone and pretending you were there with me. Sometimes I'd even set 2 places at the table and have conversations with your empty chair. We sat with that image between us. 15 years of anniversary dinners eaten alone. 15 years of mourning a death that never happened. 15 years of missing each other while our son counted the money he'd stolen from both of us. Do you know what the cruelest part is?" I asked. "What?" "All those years, I kept waiting for the grief to get easier. People told me that time heals all wounds, that eventually I'd be able to think about you without crying, that someday I'd be ready to move on. But it never happened. 15 years later, I missed you just as much as I did the day Richard told me you were dead." Blaine reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "Because real love doesn't die, even when we think the person does. You were mourning someone who was still alive, Still loving you, still missing you just as much. Were you? Missing me? Every single day. I used to carry your picture in my wallet until it got stolen along with everything else I owned. After that, I was terrified I'd forget what you looked like, so I'd spend hours every day trying to remember your face, your voice, the way you laughed at my terrible jokes. The waitress came by with more coffee, and we both wiped our eyes, probably looking like two crazy people crying over breakfast in a dingy diner. But I didn't care who saw us or what they thought. After 15 years of holding back tears, of grieving in private, of pretending to be stronger than I felt, it was a relief to cry openly. "Blaine," I said when I could speak again, "we can't get those years back. 15 years of marriage, 15 years of growing old together, 15 years of small moments and shared experiences. Richard stole all of that from us, and it's gone forever." He nodded, understanding the weight of what I was saying. "But we can have whatever time is left. We can choose to move forward together, to build something new from what Richard tried to destroy." Blaine squeezed my hand tighter. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want my husband back. Not just as someone to survive with or plot revenge against Richard with, but as my partner, my companion, my love. I want to try to reclaim what we had, even if we can't reclaim the time we lost." The smile that spread across Blaine's face was like sunrise after the longest night of my life. "Are you proposing to me, Glenda Morrison?" I laughed through my tears, feeling lighter than I had in 15 years. "I suppose I am. Will you marry me again, Blaine? Will you help me figure out how to be happy again?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Yes, and yes, and yes." And sitting in that rundown diner, broke and homeless but together again, I felt richer than Richard with all his millions could ever dream of being. Finding a lawyer willing to take our case without payment up front proved almost impossible. Most of the attorneys we contacted took one look at our situation, a homeless man and a woman with $800 to her name, and politely declined to help. But on our 4th day of searching, we met Sarah Chen at the legal aid office downtown. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too many cases like ours. But when Blaine explained our situation, her expression shifted from professional sympathy to genuine outrage. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "Your son told each of you that the other had died, used fake documentation to support these lies, then systematically stole your business and left you both destitute?" "That's exactly right," I said. "And now he's worth millions while his father lives on the streets and I just got kicked out of my own home." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "In 30 years of practicing law, I've seen some terrible things, but this is sociopathic behavior. The level of planning and cruelty involved is staggering." She pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. "The good news is that you have multiple causes of action here. Fraud, elder abuse, theft, forgery, possibly even kidnapping by deception, depending on how the courts interpret emotional manipulation." "What's the bad news?" Blaine asked. "The bad news is that after 15 years, the statute of limitations has expired on some of these crimes. And proving what happened is going to be challenging, especially since Richard had time to cover his tracks and legitimize his ownership of your assets." My heart sank. "So there's nothing we can do?" "I didn't say that," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing fraud, and if Richard is still actively benefiting from stolen assets, we can argue that the fraud is continuing. Plus, elder abuse has longer limitation periods, and the emotional trauma you've both suffered could qualify." She spent the next hour taking detailed notes about our story, asking for specific dates, names, and documents. I was amazed by how much Blaine remembered, despite the drinking and depression. Apparently, grief had burned certain details into his memory with perfect clarity. "I'll need to do some research on Morrison Holdings," Sarah said finally. "If the company is still operating under assets that were fraudulently obtained, We might be able to freeze Richard's accounts and force him to prove legitimate ownership. How long will that take? I asked. A few weeks to build the case, possibly months to see any real results. In the meantime, you both need somewhere stable to live. The shelter isn't a long-term solution. That evening, back at the shelter, Blaine and I huddled together in the common room making plans. My small savings were dwindling fast. Coffee and meals added up quickly when you were buying everything from restaurants, and we needed to find a more permanent arrangement soon. I know a place, Blaine said hesitantly. It's not much, but there's a boarding house about 15 minutes from here. The landlord, Mrs. Patterson, she's understanding about people in difficult circumstances. I stayed there for a few months 2 years ago when I was trying to get sober. Can we afford it? She charges $300 a month for a room, utilities included, if we share a room. He paused, suddenly looking uncertain. I mean, if you're comfortable with that. I know it's been 15 years, and we're essentially strangers now in some ways. The vulnerability in his voice broke my heart. This man had been my husband for over 20 years, had shared my bed and my dreams and my fears, and now he was asking permission to share a room with me like we were teenagers on a first date. Blaine, I said gently, you're my husband. We've been apart for 15 years, yes? But that doesn't make us strangers. It just means we have some catching up to do. The relief on his face was palpable. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a 3-story Victorian that had seen better days but retained a certain faded dignity. The landlord herself was a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She looked us over carefully when Blaine introduced me as his wife. Thought you said your wife was dead, she said bluntly. That's what I believed, Blaine replied. Turns out my son lied to both of us. We just found each other again 3 days ago. Mrs. Patterson studied us both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Room 12 on the 2nd floor. Bathrooms shared with the room next door, but the current tenant works nights so you shouldn't have conflicts. First month's rent in advance, no exceptions. I counted out $300 from my rapidly diminishing savings, trying not to think about how quickly we were going through money with no income coming in. The room was small but clean, with a double bed, a tiny dresser, and a window that looked out onto a narrow alley. After days of sleeping apart in the shelter, the privacy felt luxurious. It's not much, Blaine said apologetically. It's ours, I replied. That makes it perfect. That night, lying in bed together for the first time in 15 years, we talked until nearly dawn. Not about Richard or revenge or legal strategies, but about small things we'd missed. Blaine told me about a stray cat he'd befriended during his second winter on the streets, how it would curl up against him for warmth, and how losing it to traffic had broken his heart all over again. I told him about the garden I'd tried to keep behind our old house, how I'd planted his favorite vegetables every spring, even though I was the only one there to eat them. I used to talk to you while I was weeding, I admitted. Tell you about my day, complain about Richard's moods, share neighborhood gossip like you were right there listening. I wish I had been, he said softly, his arm tightening around me. I wish I could have heard every word. The next few weeks fell into a routine. Blaine would spend mornings looking for odd jobs, construction work when he could find it, labor when he couldn't. I took a part-time position at a small cafe near the boarding house, serving coffee and sandwiches to office workers during the lunch rush. The pay was terrible, and my feet ached constantly, but it was income we desperately needed. Evenings were for planning. Sarah had uncovered some promising information about Morrison Holdings, including the fact that several properties currently owned by the company had originally been purchased with funds from Morrison Construction's accounts. More importantly, she'd found irregularities in the documentation of the business transfer, signatures that looked forged, witness statements that seemed fabricated. Richard got sloppy, she explained during one of our meetings. When you're stealing from people who are too grief-stricken to pay attention, you don't worry much about covering your tracks perfectly. But legal documents require precision, and there are several instances where his forgeries don't quite hold up to scrutiny. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after we'd started working with Sarah. She burst into the cafe during my afternoon shift, her face flushed with excitement. We've got him, she announced without preamble. The judge granted our motion to freeze Richard's assets pending investigation of fraud claims. I nearly dropped the coffee pot I was holding. What does that mean exactly? It means Richard can't sell, transfer, or spend any money from accounts connected to Morrison Holdings until the court determines legitimate ownership. His bank accounts are frozen, his credit cards are suspended, and he can't access any funds beyond what's in his personal checking account. The magnitude of this hit me slowly. Richard, who just weeks ago had been gloating about his lottery winnings and throwing me out for being worthless, was now trapped in the same kind of financial limbo he'd imposed on his father 15 years earlier. "How long will the freeze last?" I asked. "Until we resolve this in court, which could be months. But here's the best part. The judge was so appalled by the evidence of fraud that she's also ordered Richard to appear for a deposition next week. He's going to have to answer questions under oath about how he acquired his assets." That night, Blaine and I celebrated with takeout Chinese food and cheap wine in our tiny room. It wasn't much of a victory yet. We were still broke, still living day to day in a boarding house, still rebuilding our lives from nothing. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Richard was the one who was powerless. "What do you think he's doing right now?" I asked, imagining Richard discovering that his bank cards had stopped working. "Panicking," Blaine said with satisfaction. "He's built his entire adult life on money he stole from us. Without access to those funds, he's got nothing. Do you think he'll try to contact us? Try to negotiate some kind of settlement?" Blaine was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Maybe. But if he does, he'll find out that we're not the same broken people he left behind. We're not grieving anymore. We're not isolated. And we're not powerless." He was right. The weeks of working together toward a common goal had been like physical therapy for our relationship. We were learning to be partners again, to support each other, to trust that neither of us would disappear without warning. The love was still there, stronger than ever, but we were building new patterns of communication and cooperation on top of that foundation. "I want our life back," I said firmly. "Not just the money, though we deserve that. I want the respect and dignity he stole from us. I want him to acknowledge what he did and apologize for every day we spent apart. And if he won't," I thought about Richard's cold eyes the day he threw me out, the casual cruelty with which he'd described me as worthless. I thought about Blaine spending winters sleeping between washing machines because our son had condemned him to homelessness through lies. "Then we'll take everything," I said quietly. "Every dollar, every asset, every piece of the life he built on our stolen foundation. And we'll rebuild what should have been ours all along." Blaine smiled and raised his wine glass in a toast. "To getting our life back." "To getting our life back," I agreed, clinking my plastic cup against his. But even as we celebrated this first small victory, I knew Richard wouldn't give up without a fight. He'd spent 15 years perfecting his lies and protecting his stolen wealth. Now that his comfortable life was threatened, he'd become dangerous in ways we probably couldn't imagine. We'd won the first battle, but the war was just beginning. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early May, 3 months after Blaine and I had found each other again. I was getting ready for my shift at the cafe when my cheap cell phone rang with an unknown number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. We'd been getting harassment calls from Richard's friends and business associates ever since news of the lawsuit had started spreading through town. But something made me answer. "Mom?" Richard's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and shaky. "Mom, please, I need to talk to you." My first instinct was to hang up immediately. But Blaine, who'd been listening from across our small room, shook his head and gestured for me to keep talking. "What do you want, Richard?" "I want to explain. I want to make this right." He sounded like he was crying, which would have moved me once upon a time. Now it just made me suspicious. "Can we meet somewhere? Just you and me? Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of your father." There was a long pause. "Dad's really alive?" The shock in his voice seemed genuine, and for a split second I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Yes, Richard. The father you told me was dead 15 years ago is very much alive. The father you left homeless and penniless while you lived like a king off the money you stole from him. I can explain everything, Mom. It's not what you think. There were reasons. circumstances you don't understand. Then explain them in court, I said coldly, with your lawyer present and under oath, like you're going to have to do anyway. Mom, please. His voice cracked. I'm losing everything. My house, my cars, my business. I can't even buy groceries without begging the bank to release emergency funds. You have to help me. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Help you? The way you helped me when you threw me out with nothing but a suitcase? The way you helped your father when you convinced him his wife was dead and then left him to rot on the streets? I made mistakes, I know that, but I'm still your son. Doesn't that mean anything to you? For 15 years, being Richard's mother had been my entire identity. I'd worked myself to exhaustion to support him, endured his criticism and cruelty because I believed family was supposed to be unconditional. But sitting in that tiny boarding house room, looking at my husband who'd survived more than a decade of homelessness because of Richard's lies, I realized something liberating. No, I said quietly. It doesn't mean anything anymore. You stopped being my son the day you decided to destroy our family for money. Richard made a choking sound that might have been a sob. Mom, you don't mean that. I absolutely do. And Richard, stop calling me. If you want to communicate, do it through our lawyer. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and righteous anger. How do you feel? Blaine asked gently. Free, I said, and meant it. For the first time in 15 years, I feel completely free. The court proceedings stretched on for months, but the outcome was never really in doubt once Sarah's investigator uncovered the extent of Richard's deception. The forged death certificates, the fabricated medical records, the illegally transferred business assets. It was all there in black and white, a paper trail of systematic fraud that Richard couldn't explain away. During his deposition, he tried several different strategies. First, he claimed he genuinely believed we were dead and had only been trying to preserve the family business. When that fell apart under cross-examination, he switched to saying he'd been protecting us from financial ruin and had planned to share the wealth eventually. Finally, in desperation, he tried to argue that we'd abandoned him emotionally and that he'd deserved compensation for the trauma of being an unloved child. That last argument particularly disgusted me. Richard had been loved and cherished and supported his entire life, right up until the moment he decided love wasn't as valuable as money. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Hendricks, had clearly seen enough family disputes to recognize manipulation when she saw it. Mr. Morrison, she said during the final hearing, in 40 years on the bench, I have never encountered a more calculated and cruel scheme of fraud against family members. You systematically destroyed your parents' lives through deception, stole their business, and condemned them to years of unnecessary suffering. The court finds you liable for fraud, elder abuse, theft, and emotional distress. The financial settlement was larger than we'd dared hope. Richard was ordered to return all assets that had originally belonged to Morrison Construction, plus 15 years of lost earnings, plus punitive damages for the emotional trauma he'd caused. When everything was calculated, including the current value of the business he'd built on our stolen foundation, the total came to nearly $12 million. But more than the money, what mattered was the public vindication. Richard's crimes were front-page news in our small town's newspaper. Everyone who'd ever known us learned the truth about what he'd done. The man who'd spent years portraying himself as a successful entrepreneur was revealed as nothing more than a thief who'd robbed his own parents. 6 months after that first phone call, Blaine and I stood in the kitchen of our new home. A modest 2-bedroom house with a garden where I could grow vegetables and a workshop where Blaine could tinker with woodworking projects. It wasn't the mansion Richard had lost, but it was ours, bought with money that had always rightfully belonged to us. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never found each other again? I asked, watching Blaine assemble a new spice rack he'd built for me. He paused in his work, considering the question. Sometimes. But then I remember that real love doesn't just disappear, even when people try to kill it with lies. We would have found our way back to each other eventually. Even if Richard had never won the lottery? Even if he'd never thrown me out? Maybe it would have taken longer, but yes. Love like ours doesn't stay buried forever. That evening, we had dinner on our small back patio, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. We'd decided to renew our wedding vows the following month, a small ceremony with just a few friends from the boarding house and Sarah as our witness. After everything we'd been through, we wanted to officially reclaim our commitment to each other. "Any regrets?" Blaine asked, reaching across the table to take my hand. I thought about the question seriously. We'd lost 15 years that we could never get back. We'd missed anniversaries and birthdays, holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings. We'd suffered loneliness and grief that had been completely unnecessary. Richard had stolen not just our money but our time, and time was the one thing no court settlement could restore. But sitting there with my husband, in our own home, with our future spread out before us like a gift we'd never expected to receive, I realized that regret was a luxury I couldn't afford. "No regrets," I said firmly. "What we lost is gone, but what we have now is precious because we know how easily it can be taken away. We're not the same people we were 15 years ago, and maybe that's not entirely a bad thing." "How so?" "We're stronger now. We survived the worst thing that could happen to a marriage, not death, but betrayal by someone we both trusted completely. If we can survive that and still choose to love each other, we can survive anything." Blaine lifted my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles gently. "To surviving anything. To surviving everything," I corrected. As for Richard, we heard through the legal grapevine that he'd moved to another state and was working construction. Ironically, the same kind of work his father had done when we were young and building our business from nothing. The lottery money was long gone, spent on legal fees and seized as part of the settlement. He'd lost his house, his cars, and most importantly, his reputation. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but no sympathy either. He'd made his choices and would have to live with the consequences, just as Blaine and I had been forced to live with the consequences of his deceptions. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, Blaine and I stood in the garden of our new home and exchanged the vows we should have been able to renew naturally over the years he'd stolen from us. "I promise to love you not just in spite of everything we've been through, but because of it," I said, looking into the warm brown eyes I'd mourned for 15 years. "I promise to choose you every day, the way I would have chosen you every day if I'd been given the chance." "I promise to never take our time together for granted," Blaine replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise to fill whatever years we have left with all the love we couldn't give each other when we were apart." Sarah, who'd become more friend than lawyer over the months of our legal battle, served as our officiant. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house cried through the entire ceremony. Even the neighbor's cat seemed to approve, purring contentedly from his perch on our back fence. When it was over, when we'd kissed as husband and wife for the first time in 15 years, when we'd cut the small cake I'd baked myself, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: complete happiness. That night, lying in our own bed in our own house, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. It had started with Richard's cruelty, with his decision to value money over family, with his willingness to destroy the people who'd loved him most. But it had ended with love triumphing over deception, with justice prevailing over fraud, with two people who'd been torn apart finding their way back to each other against impossible odds. "Glenda?" Blaine's voice was soft in the darkness. "Thank you for not giving up. On me, on us, on the idea that we could find each other again. Thank you for surviving long enough for me to find you." We fell asleep holding hands, the way we had when we were young and believed that love could conquer anything. Now we knew it could, but only if you were strong enough to fight for it, smart enough to recognize it when you found it again, and brave enough to rebuild it from whatever pieces remained. Richard had tried to destroy our family, but in the end, he'd only made it stronger. Because the family we'd rebuilt was founded not on obligation or habit or simple proximity, but on conscious choice, deep appreciation, and hard-won wisdom. And that kind of love, forged in the fire of loss and renewed in the joy of rediscovery, was truly unbreakable. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.